immediately vying for central territory, and opening diagonals for the queen and bishop signals aggressive intentions. Contesting the center immediately creates a rich positional battlefield and symmetrical pawn structure, setting the stage for open play. Instantly challenging the pawn's central claim, knight now eyes the f7 weakness. Developing the knight here builds a strong central pawn chain and prepares for rapid piece coordination. Unleashing development, this bishop targets the vulnerable f7 square, setting a potent attacking geometry. Developing the bishop to a central diagonal, it eyes the f2 pawn and supports the e5 pawn, establishing classical Italian game principles. Securing the monarch's safety sets the stage for an assault on black's uncastled king. Challenging white's central pawn and developing a piece simultaneously, black bravely confronts the king's knight. Solidifying the center and preparing to develop the queen's, bishop opens up the queenside pawns for future advances. Preparing a queenside expansion with b5, while subtly reinforcing the central control. Solidifying the center and preparing for a queenside pawn advance, this move aims to restrict black's knight and prepare further queenside expansion. Retreating the bishop to a7, while seemingly safe, relinquishes control of the crucial dark squares, allowing white's pieces greater maneuverability. Solidifying the central pawn structure and preparing for a potential queenside expansion, this knight strategically repositions for enhanced control. Castling now shores up the king and prepares to connect the rooks for future operations. Steering the bishop towards the a2-g8 diagonal opens lines for a potential queen maneuver and increases pressure on the kingside, subtly preparing for future central advances. Solidifying the center and preparing for a potential pawn break, this move builds a robust defensive structure around the king. Repositioning the knight to nc4 aims to exploit black's slightly passive bishop on a7 and pressure the queenside pawn structure. Securing the king's escape route, a subtle yet vital defensive maneuver that avoids early confrontation while preparing for future middle game action. Preparing to unleash the central pawn storm, white simultaneously shores up its queen's knight. Bringing the rook to e8 now begins a quiet repositioning, preparing to contest the central file and potentially support a pawn push in the future. Developing the bishop to its most active square, it now supports a potential kingside pawn push and prepares for central maneuvering. Bravely venturing outward, black seeks to challenge white's queenside pawns and create new attacking avenues. Consolidating the knight for a potential kingside assault or a strategic repositioning to the center seems to be the idea. A bold excursion for the knight, aiming to dislodge the bishop and potentially disrupt white's queenside structure. Shifting the bishop to c2 strategically bolsters the queenside pawns and prepares for potential kingside action, while keeping an eye on the central squares. Black reshapes the pawn structure to challenge white's central influence and free the knight. Safeguarding the kingside from potential knight infiltrations, this quiet pawn advance prepares for future queenside play while subtly reinforcing the center. Unleashing central tension, d5 boldly challenges white's pawn structure and opens lines for black's pieces. Repositioning the knight to f1 aims to bolster the kingside defense and prepare a potential kingside attack, while also freeing up the e-file for the rook. Confronting the central pawn structure, black initiates a dynamic exchange, seeking to unravel white's cramped position and potentially open lines for their pieces. Embracing the open central files now with this pawn recapture significantly opens lines for your pieces and prepares a potential kingside assault. Activating the knight to c4 immediately challenges white's central control and prepares for further queenside expansion. Exchanging queens simplifies the game. White aims to exploit the open files and potentially a weaker king position for black. Relinquishing the queen opens up the h-file, potentially creating a sanctuary for your king amidst the evolving battlefield. Strategically rerouting the bishop to a more active square, preparing potential queenside expansion. A solid piece retreat, aiming to redeploy the bishop to a more active diagonal after white's bishop vacates its post. Rerouting the knight to a more active square, aiming to pressure black's queenside pawn structure and potentially exploit the open d-file. This redeployment of the rook to the e-file aims to contest central pawn control and potentially activate the piece later. Opening a queenside pawn storm to challenge black's space and potentially create a passed pawn. Provoking pawn advances on the queenside opens new avenues for black's knight. Confronting black's pawn advance, this secures the queenside from further incursions. Shattering the pawn shield, black opens lines for their rooks and bishop, aiming to exploit white's weakened queenside pawn structure. Opening that b-file offers dynamic counterplay against white's isolated d-pawn, a crucial endgame consideration. Liberating the bishop from its passive diagonal, this piece now eyes the a7-g1 diagonal, seeking better influence. Recapturing that pawn opens a diagonal for your bishop, eyeing black's potentially exposed king. Unleashing the bishop from its passive outpost, this move aims to disrupt white's pawn structure and activate its powerful diagonal influence. Exchanges the bishop for a knight, simplifying the position and aiming to exploit black's isolated pawns. Liberating the bishop, this maneuver unlocks diagonal influence and prepares for potential pawn pushes on the queen side, creating dynamic counterplay. Recentering the bishop after the exchange aims to bolster central control and prepare for potential pawn breaks. A bold attempt to exploit the open diagonal and target white's weakened queenside pawn structure. Reclaiming the outpost is white's priority, but this retreat feels passive, allowing black consolidation. Squeezing the central pawn structure opens lines for the bishop and creates a queenside pawn chain. Boldly venturing the knight forward, aiming to disrupt black's coordinated pieces and seize initiative in the center. Exchanges the bishop for a knight, simplifying the position and potentially opening lines for white's remaining pieces. Sacrificing the knight opens a clear diagonal for the queen, aiming to exploit black's cramped queenside pawns. Aggressively challenging the central pawn structure, this move aims to disrupt white's piece harmony and open critical diagonals for the bishops. Fortifying the kingside pawn structure solidifies white's position against potential queenside counterplay. Reasserting pressure on the central files, this maneuver aims to disrupt white's queenside structure. This maneuver aims to seize the open file and threaten to trap the isolated b-pawn. Consolidating forces on the open file offers a chance to organize a decisive queenside initiative. Reclaiming the open file solidifies control over the c-file for a potential attack on black's queenside. Injecting the knight into the central vacuum offers counterplay and challenges white's control. Injecting a knight deep into black's territory, challenging the bishop's outpost and creating dynamic pressure. Repositioning the king to a safer square, preparing for potential breakthroughs. Opening the b-file to pressure black's queenside and potentially disrupt their structure. Reasserting central influence, the knight eyes the weakened e4 pawn and prepares to occupy the d5 outpost. The knight's retreat from the skirmish opens avenues for pawn advances across the board. Repositioning the rook to b5 aims to challenge the open b-file and potentially support queenside pawn advances. Preparing to double rooks on the file aims to pressure black's queenside pawn structure. Reasserting central pressure, the rook aims to solidify the d-file's influence and create new attacking possibilities. Exchanging rooks simplifies the position, opening lines for active pieces and preparing for a potential endgame push. Capturing the pawn with the rook opens the file for white's rook to become significantly more active. Transitioning to a rook endgame, white seeks to exploit the open files and potentially create a passed pawn. Centralizing the king here ushers in a new phase, preparing for active participation in the upcoming endgame. Unleashing pawns to seize space and potentially splinter black's structure. Recapturing the pawn on c6 allows the rook to participate in the defense of its own pawn structure. Capturing the pawn on b5 forces the queen back, simplifying into a more advantageous endgame for white's pieces. Recapturing the pawn immediately opens up the rook and queen for black, creating active counterplay on the queen's side. Sacrificing the exchange opens up black's king and forces them into a passive position. The king's escape route is now tragically cut off by his own pawns and the rook exchange. The rook's active placement on the 5th rank now threatens to split black's pawns and disrupt their coordination. Seeking to disrupt white's rook coordination, black gambles for activity, hoping to exploit the open king. Securing the king's escape route against any immediate checks becomes paramount with this retreat. A strategic repositioning, this rook eyes the open queen's file and potential discoveries on the white king. A decisive blow, forcing the black king into a precarious square and initiating the mating sequence. Focusing the knight toward the king's flank offers a glimmer of attacking hope in this otherwise stalemated position. Asserting control over the d5 square is paramount, preventing the enemy knight from further incursions. The knight's return to a central outpost offers black greater activity and potential piece exchange opportunities. Capturing the pawn on c4 stabilizes the center and opens lines for your rook, preparing to exploit weaknesses. Trading off the bishop on c4 simplifies the position, aiming to exploit the pawn structure. Repositioning the rook to the open file immediately activates white's heaviest piece. Initiating pawn advances to unlock your king's defensive potential. Clearing the path for the rook to become more active on the open file. Shifting the king back aims to consolidate the defensive structure and prepare for a potential pawn push. Consolidating the pawn chain's power becomes paramount now. Opening the d-file for the rook immediately places pressure on white's queenside. Bolstering the kingside pawn structure offers crucial defensive support. Propping open the kingside for potential counterplay becomes a risky business. Shifting the king offers a vital escape square and prepares to support the advancing pawns. Unleashing the pawns in a dramatic bid to complicate matters, potentially opening lines for black's rook. Sacrificing the pawn opens lines and exposes the king. Opening up the king's path for an onslaught across the center ranks. Pushing the passed pawn, aiming to create unstoppable queens. Seeking to tie down the rook and create passed pawn opportunities, but allows the white king to advance. Clearing the 8th rank for the rook allows it to become a more active participant in the central struggle. Securing the advanced pawn presents a vital defensive task for black's king. The pawn push solidifies the queenside, aiming to create a passed pawn and control the crucial 7th rank. A desperate check, probing for a last-ditch tactical trick to disrupt white's looming pawn promotion. The king's exposed position invites immediate threats, necessitating a proactive defense. Unlocking attacking potential, black gambits a pawn to shatter white's defensive pawn structure and create immediate threats around the king. Opening the g-file finally grants access to the king's sanctuary. The knight's redeployment to d6 aims to solidify the pawn structure and prepare for potential counterplay. Activating the rook to force the enemy king into a less secure position. Seeking to activate the king and challenge the open c-file, an aggressive maneuver. Securing the newly opened file with the rook solidifies control and prepares for potential breakthroughs. The black king, exposed on the kingside, faces imminent peril as white mobilizes a potent mating attack. The pawn's relentless march to promotion demands immediate attention, potentially untangling this complex endgame. Capturing the pawn offers a temporary pawn gain, but neglects the immediate threat to the king's safety. Unleashing a checking onslaught that forces the black king into a perilous, exposed position.